The Capture of Bill Sikes by Charles Dickens. It was nearly 2 hours before daybreak, that time which, in the autumn of the year, may be truly called the dead of night, when the streets are silent and deserted, when even sound appears to slumber, and profligacy and riot have staggered home to dream. It was at this still and silent hour that the Jew sat watching in his old lair, with face so distorted and pale, and eyes so red and bloodshot, that he looked less like a man than like some hideous phantom, moist from the grave and worried by an evil spirit. He sat crouching over a cold hearth, wrapped in an old torn coverlet, with his face turned toward a wasting candle that stood upon a table by his side. His right hand was raised to his lips, and as, absorbed in thought, he bit his long black nails, he disclosed among his toothless gums a few such fangs as should have been a dog's or rat's. Stretched upon a mattress on the floor lay Noah Claypole, fast asleep. Toward him the old man sometimes directed his eyes for an instant, and then brought them back again to the candle, which, with long-burned wick drooping almost double, and hot grease falling down in clots upon the table, plainly showed that his thoughts were busy elsewhere. Indeed, they were. Mortification at the overthrow of his notable scheme, hatred of the girl who had dared to palter with strangers, an utter distrust of the sincerity of her refusal to yield him up, bitter disappointment at the loss of his revenge on Sikes, the fear of detection and ruin and death, and a fierce and deadly rage kindled by all. These were the passionate considerations which, following close upon each other with rapid and ceaseless whirl, shot through the brain of Fagin, as every evil thought and blackest purpose lay working at his heart. He sat without changing his attitude in the least, or appearing to take the smallest heed of time, until his quick ear seemed to be attracted by a footstep in the street. "At last," muttered the Jew, wiping his dry and fevered mouth. "At last." The bell rang gently as he spoke. He crept upstairs to the door, and presently returned accompanied by a man muffled to the chin, who carried a bundle under one arm. Sitting down and throwing back his outer coat, the man displayed the burly frame of Sikes. "There," he said, laying the bundle on the table. "Take care of that, and do the most you can with it. It's been trouble enough to get. I thought I should have been in here 3 hours ago." Fagin laid his hand upon the bundle, and, locking it in the cupboard, sat down again without speaking. But he did not take his eyes off the robber for an instant during this action, and now that they sat over against each other, face to face, he looked fixedly at him, with his lips quivering so violently, and his face so altered by the emotions which had mastered him, that the housebreaker involuntarily drew back his chair and surveyed him with a look of real affright. "What now?" cried Sikes. "What do you look at a man so for?" The Jew raised his right hand and shook his trembling forefinger in the air, but his passion was so great that the power of speech was for the moment gone. "Damn!" said Sikes, feeling in his breast with a look of alarm. "He's gone mad. I must look to myself here." No, rejoined Fagin, finding his voice. "It's not. You're not the person, Bill. I've no fault to find with you." "Oh, you haven't you?" said Sikes, looking sternly at him, and ostentatiously passing a pistol into a more convenient pocket. "That's lucky. For one of us. Which one that is, don't matter." "I've got that to tell you, Bill," said the Jew, drawing his chair nearer. "We'll make you worse than me." "I?" returned the robber with an incredulous air. "Tell away. Look sharp, or Nance will think I'm lost." "Lost!" cried Fagin. "She has pretty well settled that in her own mind already." Sikes looked with an aspect of great perplexity into the Jew's face, and reading no satisfactory explanation of the riddle there, clinched his coat collar in his huge hand and shook him soundly. "Speak, will you?" he said. "Or if you don't, it shall be for want of breath. Open your mouth and say what you've got to say in plain words. Out with it, you thundering old cur, out with it." "Suppose that lad that's lying there," Fagin began. Sikes turned around to where Noah was sleeping, as if he had not previously observed him. "Well," he said, resuming his former position. "Suppose that lad," pursued the Jew, "was to peach, to blow upon us all, first seeking out the right folks for the purpose, and then having a meeting with them in the street to paint our likenesses, describe every mark that they might know us by, and the crib where we might be most easily taken. Suppose he was to do all this, and besides to blow upon a plant we've all been in, more or less, of his own fancy. Not grabbed, trapped, tried, earwigged by the parson and brought to it on bread and water, but of his own fancy. To please his own taste, stealing out at nights to find those most interested against us, and peaching to them. Do you hear me?" cried the Jew, his eyes flashing with rage. "Suppose he did all this. What then?" "What then?" replied Sikes with a tremendous oath. "If he was left alive till I came, I'd grind his skull under the iron heel of my boot into as many grains as there are hairs upon his head." "What if I did it?" cried the Jew, almost in a yell. "I that know so much, and could hang so many besides myself." "I don't know," replied Sikes, clenching his teeth and turning white at the mere suggestion. "I'd do something in the jail that'd get me put in irons, and if I was tried along with you, I'd fall upon you with them in the open court and beat your brains out afore the people. I should have such strength," muttered the robber, poising his brawny arm, "that I could smash your head as if a loaded wagon had gone over it." "You would." "Would I?" said the housebreaker. "Try me. If it was Charlie, or the Dodger, or Bet, or—" "I don't care who," replied Sikes impatiently. "Whoever it was, I'd serve them the same." Fagin looked hard at the robber, and motioning him to be silent, stooped over the bed upon the floor, and shook the sleeper to rouse him. Sikes leaned forward in his chair, looking on with his hands upon his knees, as if wondering much what all this questioning and preparation was to end in. "Bolter! Bolter! Poor lad," said Fagin, looking up with an expression of devilish anticipation, and speaking slowly and with marked emphasis. "He's tired. Tired with watching for her so long. Watching for her, Bill." "What do you mean?" asked Sikes, drawing back. The Jew made no answer, but bending over the sleeper again, hauled him into a sitting posture. When his assumed name had been repeated several times, Noah rubbed his eyes, and, giving a heavy yawn, looked sleepily about him. "Tell me that again. Once again, just for him to hear," said the Jew, pointing to Sikes as he spoke. "Tell you what?" asked the sleepy Noah, shaking himself pettishly. "That about Nancy," said the Jew, clutching Sikes by the wrist, as if to prevent his leaving the house before he had heard enough. "You followed her?" "Yes." "To London Bridge?" "Yes." "Where she met two people?" "So she did. A gentleman and a lady that she had gone to of her own accord before, who asked her to give up all her pals, and monks first, which she did, and to describe him, which she did, and to tell her what house it was that we meet at, and go to, which she did, and where it could be best watched from, which she did, and what time the people went there, which she did. She did all this. She told it all, every word, without a threat, without a murmur. She did." "Did she not?" cried the Jew, half mad with fury. "All right," replied Noah, scratching his head. "That's just what it was." "What did they say about last Sunday?" demanded the Jew. "About last Sunday," replied Noah, considering. "Why, I told you that before." "Again?" "Tell it again," cried Fagin, tightening his grasp on Sikes and brandishing his other hand aloft as the foam flew from his lips. "They asked her," said Noah, who, as he grew more wakeful, seemed to have a dawning perception who Sikes was. "They asked her why she didn't come last Sunday as she promised. She said she couldn't." "Why?" "Why?" interrupted the Jew triumphantly. "Tell him that." "Because she was forcibly kept at home by Bill, the man she had told them of before," replied Noah. "What more of him?" cried the Jew. "What more of the man she had told them of before?" "Tell him that." "Tell him that." "Why?" "That she couldn't very easily get out of doors unless he knew where she was going to," said Noah. "And so the first time she went to see the lady, she—" "Ha! Ha! 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 It made me laugh when she said it, that it did. She gave him a drink of laudanum." "Hell's fire!" cried Sikes, breaking fiercely from the Jew. "Let me go!" Flinging the old man from him, he rushed from the room and darted wildly and furiously up the stairs. "Bill! Bill!" cried the Jew, following him hastily. "A word! Only a word!" The word would not have been exchanged, but that the housebreaker was unable to open the door, on which he was expending fruitless oaths and violence when the Jew came panting up. "Let me out," said Sikes. "Don't speak to me. It's not safe." "Let me out, I say." "Hear me speak a word," rejoined the Jew, laying his hand upon the lock. "You won't be." "Well?" replied the other. "You won't be too violent, Bill," whined the Jew. The day was breaking, and there was light enough for the men to see each other's faces. They exchanged one brief glance. There was a fire in the eyes of both which could not be mistaken. "I mean," said Fagin, showing that he felt all disguise was now useless, "not too violent for safety. Be crafty, Bill, and not too bold." Sikes made no reply, but pulling open the door, of which the Jew had turned the lock, dashed into the silent streets. Without one pause or moment's consideration, without once turning his head to the right or left, or raising his eyes to the sky or lowering them to the ground, but looking straight before him with savage resolution, his teeth so tightly compressed that the strained jaw seemed starting through his skin, the robber held on his headlong course, nor muttered a word, nor relaxed a muscle, until he reached his own door. He opened it softly with a key, strode lightly up the stairs, and entering his own room, double-locked the door, and lifting the heavy table against it, drew back the curtain of the bed. The girl was lying half-dressed upon it. He had roused her from her sleep, for she raised herself with a hurried and startled look. "Get up," said the man. "It is you, Bill," said the girl, with an expression of pleasure at his return. "It is," was the reply. "Get up." There was a candle burning, but the man hastily drew it from the candlestick and hurled it under the grate. Seeing the faint light of early day without, the girl rose to undraw the curtain. "Let it be," said Sikes, thrusting his hand before her. "There's light enough for what I've got to do." "Bill," said the girl in a low voice of alarm, "why do you look like that at me?" The robber sat regarding her for a few seconds with dilated nostrils and heaving breast, and then, grasping her by the head and throat, dragged her into the middle of the room, and looking once toward the door, placed his heavy hand upon her mouth. "Bill, Bill," gasped the girl, wrestling with the strength of mortal fear. I won't scream or cry. Not once. Hear me? Speak to me. Tell me what I have done." "You know, you she-devil," returned the robber, suppressing his breath. "You were watched tonight. Every word you said was heard." "Then spare my life, for the love of heaven, as I spared yours," rejoined the girl, clinging to him. "Why, Bill, dear Bill, you cannot have the heart to kill me. Oh, think of all I have given up only this one night for you. You shall have time to think, and save yourself this crime. I will not loose my hold. You cannot throw me off. Bill, Bill, for dear God's sake, for your own, for mine, stop before you spill my blood. I have been true to you. Upon my guilty soul I have." The man struggled violently to release his arms, but those of the girl were clasped round his, and tear her as he would, he could not tear them away. "Bill," cried the girl, striving to lay her head upon his breast, "the gentleman and that dear lady told me tonight of a home in some foreign country where I could end my days in solitude and peace. Let me see them again, and beg them on my knees to show the same mercy and goodness to you. And let us both leave this dreadful place, and far apart, lead better lives, and forget how we have lived, except in prayers, and never see each other more. It is never too late to repent. They told me so. I feel it now. But we must have time. A little time." The housebreaker freed one arm and grasped his pistol. The certainty of immediate detection if he fired flashed across his mind even in the midst of his fury, and he beat it twice with all the force he could summon upon the upturned face that almost touched his own. She staggered and fell, nearly blinded with the blood that rained down from a deep gash in her forehead. But raising herself with difficulty on her knees, drew from her bosom a white handkerchief, Rose Maylie's own, and holding it up in her folded hands, as high toward heaven as her feeble strength would allow, breathed one prayer for mercy to her Maker. It was a ghastly figure to look upon, the murderer staggering backward to the wall, and shutting out the sight with his hand, seized a heavy club and struck her down. Of all bad deeds that, under cover of the darkness, had been committed within wide London's bounds since night hung over it, that was the worst. Of all the horrors that rose with an ill scent upon the morning air, that was the foulest and most cruel. The sun, the bright sun that brings back not light alone, but new life and hope and freshness to man, burst upon the crowded city in clear and radiant glory. Through costly colored glass and paper-mended window, though cathedral dome and a rotten crevice, it shed its equal ray. It lighted up the room where the murdered woman lay. It did. He tried to shut it out, but it would stream in. If the sight had been a ghastly one in the dull morning, what was it now in all that brilliant light? He had not moved. He had been afraid to stir. There had been a moan and motion of the hand, and with terror added to rage he had struck and struck again. Once he threw a rug over it, but it was worse to fancy the eyes and imagine them moving toward him than to see them glaring upward, as if watching the reflection of the pool of gore that quivered and danced in the sunlight on the ceiling. He had plucked it off again, and there was the body, mere flesh and blood, no more but such flesh and so much blood. He struck a light, kindled a fire, and thrust the club into it. There was hair upon the end which blazed and shrunk into a light cinder, and caught by the air, whirled up the chimney. Even that frightened him, sturdy as he was, but he held the weapon till it broke, and then piled it on the coals to burn away and smolder into ashes. He washed himself and rubbed his clothes. There were spots that would not be removed, but he cut the pieces out and burned them. How those stains were dispersed about the room! The very feet of the dog were bloody. All this time he had never once turned his back upon the corpse. No, not for a moment. Such preparations completed, he moved backward toward the door, dragging the dog with him, lest he should soil his feet anew and carry out new evidences of the crime into the streets. He shut the door softly, locked it, took the key, and left the house. He crossed over and glanced up at the window to be sure that nothing was visible from the outside. There was the curtain still drawn, which she would have opened to admit the light she never saw again. It lay nearly under there. He knew that. God, how the sun poured down upon the very spot. The glance was instantaneous. It was a relief to have got free of the room. He whistled on the dog and walked rapidly away. He went through Islington, strode up the hill at Highgate on which stands the stone in honor of Whittington, turned down to Highgate Hill, unsteady of purpose and uncertain where to go, struck off to the right again almost as soon as he began to descend it, and taking the footpath across the fields, skirted Caen Wood, and so came out on Hampstead Heath. Traversing the hollow by the Vale of Health, he mounted the opposite bank, and crossing the road which joins the villages of Hampstead and Highgate, made along the remaining portion of the heath to the fields at North End, in one of which he laid himself down under a hedge and slept. Soon he was up again and away, not far into the country, but back toward London by the high road, then back again, then over another part of the same ground as he had already traversed, then wandering up and down in fields and lying on ditches' brinks to rest, and starting up to make for some other spot, and do the same, and ramble on again. Where could he go that was near and not too public, to get some meat and drink? Hendon. That was a good place, not far off and out of most people's way. Thither he directed his steps, running sometimes and sometimes, with a strange perversity, loitering at a snail's pace or stopping altogether and idly breaking the hedges with his stick. But when he got there, all the people he met, the very children at the doors, seemed to view him with suspicion. Back he turned again, without the courage to purchase bit or drop, though he had tasted no food for many hours, and once more he lingered on the heath, uncertain where to go. He wandered over miles and miles of ground, and still came back to the old place. Morning and noon had passed, and the day was on the wane, and still he rambled to and fro and up and down and round, and still lingered about the same spot. At last he got away and shaped his course for Hatfield. It was 9 o'clock at night when the man, quite tired out, and the dog, limping and lame from the unaccustomed exercise, turned down the hill by the church of the quiet village, and plodding along the little street, crept into a small public house, whose scanty light had guided them to the spot. There was a fire in the tap-room, and some country laborers were drinking before it. They made room for the stranger, but he sat down in the furthest corner, and ate and drank alone, or rather with his dog, to whom he cast a morsel of food from time to time. The conversation of the men assembled here turned upon the neighboring land and farmers, and when those topics were exhausted, upon the age of some old man who had been buried on the previous Sunday. The young men present considering him very old, and the old men present declaring him to have been quite young, not older, one white-haired grandfather said, than he was, with 10 or 15 years of life in him, at least, if he had taken care. If he had taken care. There was nothing to attract attention or excite alarm in this. The robber, after paying his reckoning, sat silent and unnoticed in his corner, and had almost dropped asleep when he was half awakened by the noisy entrance of a newcomer. This was an antic fellow, half peddler and half mountebank, who traveled about the country on foot, to vend owns, strops, razors, wash balls, harness paste, medicine for dogs and horses, cheap perfumery, cosmetics, and such like wares, which he carried in a case slung to his back. His entrance was the signal for various homely jokes with the countrymen, which slackened not until he had made his supper, and opened his box of treasures, when he ingeniously contrived to unite business with amusement. "And what be that stoof? Good to eat, Harry?" asked a grinning countryman, pointing to some composition cakes in one corner. "This," said the fellow, producing one, "this is the infallible and invaluable composition for removing all sorts of stain, rust, dirt, mildew, spick, speck, spot, or spatter from silk, satin, linen, cambric, cloth, crepe, stuff, carpet, merino, muslin, bombazine, or woolen stuff. Wine stains, fruit stains, beer stains, water stains, paint stains, pitch stains, any stains. All come out at one rub with the infallible and invaluable composition. If a lady stains her honor, she has only need to swallow one cake, and she's cured at once for its poison. If a gentleman wants to prove his, he has only need to bolt one little square, and he has put it beyond question. For it's quite as satisfactory as a pistol bullet, and a great deal nastier in the flavor. Consequently, the more credit in taking it. 1 penny a square. With all these virtues, 1 penny a square." There were 2 buyers directly, and more of the listeners plainly hesitated. The vendor, observing this, increased in loquacity. "It's all bought up as fast as it can be made," said the fellow. "There are 14 water mills, 6 steam engines, and a galvanic battery, always a-working upon it, and they can't make it fast enough, though the men work so hard that they die off, and the widows is pensioned directly, with £20 a year for each of the children, and a premium of 50 for twins. 1 penny a square. 2 halfpence is all the same, and 4 farthings is received with joy. 1 penny a square. Wine stains, fruit stains, beer stains, water stains, paint stains, pitch stains, mud stains, blood stains. Here is a stain upon the hat of a gentleman in the company that I'll take clean out before he can order me a pint of ale." "Ha!" cried Sikes, starting up. "Give that back." "I'll take it clean out, sir," replied the man, winking to the company, "before you can come across the room to get it. Gentlemen, all observe the dark stain upon this gentleman's hat, no wider than a shilling, but thicker than a half-crown, whether it is a wine stain, fruit stain, beer stain, water stain, paint stain, pitch stain, mud stain, or blood stain." The man got no further, for Sikes, with a hideous imprecation, overthrew the table, and tearing the hat from him, burst out of the house. With the same perversity of feeling and irresolution that had fastened upon him despite himself all day, the murderer, finding that he was not followed, and that they most probably considered him some drunken, sullen fellow, turned back up the town, and getting out of the glare of the lamps of a stagecoach that was standing in the street, was walking past, when he recognized the mail from London, and saw that it was standing at the little post office. He almost knew what was to come, but he crossed over and listened. The guard was standing at the door, waiting for the letter bag. A man dressed like a gamekeeper came up at the moment, and he handed him a basket which lay ready on the pavement. "That's for your people," said the guard. "Now look alive in there, will you? Damn that ear bag. It warn't ready night afore last. This won't do, you know." "Anything new up in town, Ben?" asked the gamekeeper, drawing back to the window shutters, the better to admire the horses. "No, nothing that I knows on," replied the man, pulling on his gloves. "Corn's up a little. I heard talk of a murder, too, down Spitalfields way, but I don't reckon much upon it." "Oh, that's quite true," said a gentleman inside who was looking out of the window. "And a dreadful murder it was?" Was it, sir? Rejoined the guard, touching his hat. Man or woman, pray, sir? A woman, replied the gentleman. It is supposed. Now, Ben, cried the coachman impatiently. Damn that 'ere bag, cried the guard. Are you gone to sleep in there? Coming, cried the office-keeper, running out. Coming, growled the guard. Ah, and so's the young ooman of property that's going to take a fancy to me, but I don't know when. Here, give hold. All right. The horn sounded a few cheerful notes, and the coach was gone. Sikes remained standing in the street, apparently unmoved by what he had just heard, and agitated by no stronger feeling than a doubt where to go. At length he went back again, and took the road which leads from Hatfield to St. Albans. He went on doggedly, but as he left the town behind him and plunged into the solitude and darkness of the road, he felt a dread and awe creeping upon him which shook him to the core. Every object before him, substance or shadow, still or moving, took the semblance of some fearful thing. But these fears were nothing compared to the sense that haunted him, of that morning's ghastly figure following at his heels. He could trace its shadow in the gloom, supply the smallest item of the outline, and note how stiff and solemn it seemed to stalk along. He could hear its garments rustling in the leaves, and every breath of wind came laden with that last low cry. If he stopped, it did the same. If he ran, it followed, not running too. That would have been a relief. But like a corpse endowed with the mere machinery of life, and borne on one slow, melancholy wind that never rose or fell. At times he turned, with desperate determination, resolved to beat this phantom off, though it should look him dead. But the hair rose on his head, and his blood stood still, for it had turned with him and was behind him then. He had kept it before him that morning, but it was behind him now, always. He leaned his back against a bank and felt that it stood above him, visibly out against the cold night sky. He threw himself upon the road, on his back upon the road. At his head it stood, silent, erect, and still a living gravestone, with its epitaph in blood. Let no man talk of murderers escaping justice, and hint that Providence must sleep. There were 20 score of violent deaths in one long minute of that agony of fear. There was a shed in a field he passed that offered shelter for the night. Before the door were 3 tall poplar trees which made it very dark within, and the wind moaned through them with a dismal wail. He could not walk on till daylight came again, and here he stretched himself close to the wall to undergo new torture. For now a vision came before him, as constant and more terrible than that from which he had escaped. Those widely staring eyes, so lusterless and so glassy that he had better borne to see them than think upon them, appeared in the midst of the darkness, light in themselves, but giving light to nothing. There were but 2, but they were everywhere. If he shut out the sight, there came the room with every well-known object. Some, indeed, that he would have forgotten if he had gone over its contents from memory, each in its accustomed place. The body was in its place, and its eyes were, as he saw them when he stole away. He got up and rushed into the field without. The figure was behind him. He re-entered the shed and shrank down once more. The eyes were there before he had laid himself along, and here he remained, in such terror as none but he can know, trembling in every limb, and the cold sweat starting from every pore, when suddenly there arose upon the night wind the noise of distant shouting and the roar of voices mingled in alarm and wonder. Any sound of men in that lonely place, even though it conveyed a real cause of alarm, was something to him. He regained his strength and energy at the prospect of personal danger, and springing to his feet, rushed into the open air. The broad sky seemed on fire, rising into the air with showers of sparks and rolling one above the other were sheets of flame, lighting the atmosphere for miles round and driving clouds of smoke in the direction where he stood. The shouts grew louder as new voices swelled the roar, and he could hear the cry of fire, mingled with the ringing of an alarm bell, the fall of heavy bodies, and the crackling of flames as they twined round some new obstacle and shot aloft as though refreshed by food. The noise increased as he looked. There were people there, men and women, light, bustle. It was like new life to him. He darted onward, straight, headlong, dashing through briar and brake, and leaping gate and fence as madly as the dog, who careered with loud and sounding bark before him. He came upon the spot. There were half-dressed figures tearing to and fro, some endeavoring to drag the frightened horses from the stables, others driving the cattle from the yard and outhouses, and others coming laden from the burning pile, amid a shower of falling sparks and the tumbling down of red-hot beams. The apertures, where doors and windows stood an hour ago, disclosed a mass of raging fire. Walls rocked and crumbled into the burning well. The molten lead and iron poured down, white-hot upon the ground. Women and children shrieked, and men encouraged each other with noisy shouts and cheers. The clanking of the engine pumps and the spurting and hissing of the water, as it fell upon the blazing wood, added to the tremendous roar. He shouted, too, till he was hoarse, and flying from memory and himself, plunged into the thickest of the throng. Hither and thither he dived that night, now working at the pumps, and now hurrying through the smoke and flame, but never ceasing to engage himself wherever noise and men were thickest. Up and down the ladders, upon the roofs of buildings, over floors that quaked and trembled with his weight, under the lee of falling bricks and stones, in every part of that great fire was he. But he bore a charmed life, and had neither scratch nor bruise, nor weariness nor thought, till morning dawned again, and only smoke and blackened ruins remained. This mad excitement over, there returned, with tenfold force, the dreadful consciousness of his crime. He looked suspiciously about him, for the men were conversing in groups, and he feared to be the subject of their talk. The dog obeyed the significant beck of his finger, and they drew off, stealthily together. He passed near an engine where some men were seated, and they called to him to share in their refreshment. He took some bread and meat, and as he drank a draught of beer, heard the firemen, who were from London, talking about the murder. "He has gone to Birmingham, they say," said one. "But they'll have him yet, for the scouts are out, and by tomorrow night there'll be a cry all through the country." He hurried off and walked till he almost dropped upon the ground, then lay down in a lane and had a long but broken and uneasy sleep. He wandered on again, irresolute and undecided, and oppressed with the fear of another solitary night. Suddenly he took the desperate resolution of going back to London. "There's somebody to speak to there, at all events," he thought. "A good hiding place, too. They'll never expect to nab me there after this country scent. Why can't I lay by for a week or so and, forcing Blunt from Fagan, get abroad to France? Damn, I'll risk it." He acted upon this impulse without delay, and choosing the least frequented roads, began his journey back, resolved to lie concealed within a short distance of the metropolis, and entering it at dusk by a circuitous route, to proceed straight to that part of it which he had fixed on for his destination. The dog, though if any descriptions of him were out, it would not be forgotten that the dog was missing, and had probably gone with him. This might lead to his apprehension as he passed along the streets. He resolved to drown him, and walked on, looking about for a pond, picking up a heavy stone and tying it to his handkerchief as he went. The animal looked up into his master's face while these preparations were making, and whether his instinct apprehended something of their purpose, or the robber's sidelong look at him was sterner than ordinary, skulked a little further in the rear than usual and cowered as he came more slowly along. When his master halted at the brink of a pool and looked round to call him, he stopped outright. "Do you hear me call? Come here," cried Sikes. The animal came up from the very force of habit. But as Sikes stooped to attach the handkerchief to his throat, he uttered a low growl and started back. "Come back," said the robber, stamping on the ground. The dog wagged his tail, but moved not. Sikes made a running noose and called him again. The dog advanced, retreated, paused an instant, turned, and scoured away at his hardest speed. The man whistled again and again, and sat down and waited in the expectation that he would return. But no dog appeared, and at length he resumed his journey. Near to that part of the Thames, on which the church at Rotherhithe abuts, where the buildings on the banks are dirtiest, and the vessels on the river blackest with the dust of colliers and the smoke of close-built, low-roofed houses, there exists, at the present day, the filthiest, the strangest, the most extraordinary of the many localities that are hidden in London, wholly unknown, even by name, to the great mass of its inhabitants. To reach this place, the visitor has to penetrate through a maze of close, narrow, and muddy streets, thronged by the roughest and poorest of waterside people, and devoted to the traffic they may be supposed to occasion. The cheapest and least delicate provisions are heaped in the shops. The coarsest and commonest articles of wearing apparel dangle at the salesman's door and stream from the house parapet and windows, jostling with unemployed laborers of the lowest class, ballast heavers, coal whippers, brazen women, ragged children, and the very raff and refuse of the river. He makes his way with difficulty along, assailed by offensive sights and smells from the narrow alleys which branch off on the right and left, and deafened by the clash of ponderous wagons that bear great piles of merchandise from the stacks of warehouses that rise from every corner. Arriving at length in streets remoter and less frequented than those through which he has passed, he walks beneath tottering house fronts projecting over the pavement, dismantled walls that seem to totter as he passes, chimneys half crushed, half hesitating to fall, windows guarded by rusty iron bars that time and dirt have almost eaten away, and every imaginable sign of desolation and neglect. In such a neighborhood beyond Dockhead in the borough of Southwark stands Jacob's Island, surrounded by a muddy ditch 6 or 8 feet deep and 15 or 20 wide when the tide is in, once called Mill Pond, but known in these days as Folly Ditch. It is a creek or inlet from the Thames, and can always be filled at high water by opening the sluices at the lead mills from which it took its old name. At such times a stranger, looking from one of the wooden bridges thrown across it at Mill Lane, will see the inhabitants of the houses on either side lowering from their back doors and windows buckets, pails, domestic utensils of all kinds, in which to haul the water up, and when his eye is turned from these operations to the houses themselves, his utmost astonishment will be excited by the scene before him. Crazy wooden galleries common to the backs of half a dozen houses, with holes from which to look upon the slime beneath. Windows broken and patched with poles thrust out on which to dry the linen that is never there. Rooms so small, so filthy, so confined that the air would seem too tainted even for the dirt and squalor which they shelter. Wooden chambers thrusting themselves out above the mud and threatening to fall into it, as some have done. Dirt-besmeared walls and decaying foundations. Every repulsive lineament of poverty, every loathsome indication of filth, rot, and garbage. All these ornament the banks of Folly Ditch. In Jacob's Island, the warehouses are roofless and empty. The walls are crumbling down. The windows are windows no more. The doors are falling into the streets. The chimneys are blackened, but they yield no smoke. 30 or 40 years ago, before losses and chancery suits came upon it, it was a thriving place. But now it is a desolate island indeed. The houses have no owners. They are broken open and entered upon by those who have the courage. And there they live, and there they die. They must have powerful motives for a secret residence, or be reduced to a destitute condition indeed, who seek a refuge in Jacob's Island. In an upper room of one of these houses, a detached house of fair size, ruinous in other respects but strongly defended, at door and window of which house the back commanded the ditch in manner already described, there were assembled 3 men who, regarding each other every now and then with looks expressive of perplexity and expectation, sat for some time in a profound and gloomy silence. One of these was Toby Crackit, another Mr. Chitling, and the third a robber of 50 years whose nose had been almost beaten in some old scuffle, and whose face bore a frightful scar which might probably be traced to the same occasion. This man was a returned transport, and his name was Caggs. "I wish," said Toby, turning to Mr. Chitling, "that you had picked out some other crib when the 2 old ones got too warm, and had not come here, my fine feller." "Why didn't you, Blunderhead?" said Caggs. "Well, I thought you'd have been a little more glad to see me than this," replied Mr. Chitling, with a melancholy air. "Why, look'ee, young gentleman," said Toby, "when a man keeps himself so very exclusive as I have done, and by that means has a snug house over his head, with nobody prying and smelling about it, it's rather a startling thing to have the honor of a visit from a young gentleman, however respectable and pleasant a person he may be to play cards with at conveniency, circumstanced as you are. Especially when the exclusive young man has got a friend stopping with him that's arrived sooner than was expected from foreign parts, and is too modest to want to be presented to the judges on his return," added Mr. Caggs. There was a short silence, after which Toby Crackit, seeming to abandon as hopeless any further effort to maintain his usual devil-may-care swagger, turned to Chitling and said, "When was Fagin took, then?" "Just at dinner time, 2 o'clock this afternoon. Charlie and I made our lucky up the wash's chimney, and Bolter got into the empty water butt, head downward, but his legs were so precious long that they stuck out at the top, and so they took him too." "And Bet?" "Poor Bet. She went to see the body, to speak to who it was," replied Chitling, his countenance falling more and more, "and went off mad, screaming and raving, and beating her head against the boards. So they put a straight waistcoat on her and took her to the hospital, and there she is." "What's come of young Bates?" demanded Caggs. "He hung about, not to come over here afore dark, but he'll be here soon," replied Chitling. "There's nowhere else to go to now, for the people at the Cripples are all in custody, and the bar of the ken. I went up there and see it with my own eyes is filled with traps." "This is a smash," observed Toby, biting his lips. "There's more than one will go with this." "The sessions are on," said Caggs. "If they get the inquest over, and Bolter turns King's evidence, as of course he will, from what he's said already, they can prove Fagin an accessory before the fact, and get the trial on Friday, and he'll swing in 6 days from this. By God!" "You should have heard the people groan," said Chitling. "The officers fought like devils, or they'd have torn him away, He was down once, but they made a ring round him and fought their way along. You should have seen how he looked about him, all muddy and bleeding, and clung to them as if they were his dearest friends. I can see him now, not able to stand upright with the pressing of the mob, and dragging him along amongst them. I can see the people jumping up, one behind another, and snarling with their teeth and making at him like wild beasts. I can see the blood upon his hair and beard, and hear the cries with which the women worked themselves into the center of the crowd at the street corner and swore they'd tear his heart out. The horror-stricken witness of the scene pressed his hands upon his ears, and with his eyes closed, got up and paced violently to and fro like one distracted. While he was thus engaged, and the two men sat by in silence with their eyes fixed upon the floor, a pattering noise was heard upon the stairs, and Sikes's dog bounded into the room. They ran to the window downstairs and into the street. The dog had jumped in at an open window. He made no attempt to follow them, nor was his master to be seen. "What's the meaning of this?" said Toby, when they had returned. "He can't be coming here. I hope not." "If he was coming here, he'd have come with the dog," said Keggs, stooping down to examine the animal, who lay panting on the floor. "Here, give us some water for him. He has run himself faint." "He's drunk it all up, every drop," said Chitling, after watching the dog some time in silence. "Covered with mud, lame, half-blind. He must have come a long way." "Where can he have come from?" exclaimed Toby. "He's been to the other kens, of course, and, finding them filled with strangers, come on here where he's been many a time and often. But where can he have come from first? And how comes he here alone, without the other?" "He. None of them called the murderer by his old name. He can't have made away with himself. What do you think?" said Chitling. Toby shook his head. "If he had," said Kaggs, "the dog'd want to lead us away to where he did it. No, I think he's got out of the country and left the dog behind. He must have given him the slip somehow, or he wouldn't be so easy." This solution, appearing the most probable one, was adopted as the right, and the dog, creeping under a chair, coiled himself up to sleep, without more notice from anybody. It being now dark, the shutter was closed, and a candle lighted and placed upon the table. The terrible events of the last 2 days had made a deep impression on all three, increased by the danger and uncertainty of their own position. They drew their chairs closer together, starting at every sound. They spoke little, and that in whispers, and were as silent and awe-stricken as if the remains of the murdered woman lay in the next room. They had sat thus some time when suddenly was heard a hurried knocking at the door below. "Young Bates," said Kaggs, looking angrily round, to check the fear he felt himself. The knocking came again. No, it wasn't he. He never knocked like that. Crackit went to the window and, shaking all over, drew in his head. There was no need to tell them who it was. His pale face was enough. The dog, too, was on the alert an instant, and ran whining to the door. "We must let him in," he said, taking up the candle. "Isn't there any help for it?" asked the other man in a hoarse voice. "None. He must come in." "Don't leave us in the dark," said Kaggs, taking down a candle from the chimney-piece and lighting it with such a trembling hand that the knocking was twice repeated before he had finished. Crackit went down to the door and returned, followed by a man with the lower part of his face buried in a handkerchief, and another tied over his head under his hat. He drew them slowly off. Blanched face, sunken eyes, hollow cheeks, beard of 3 days' growth, wasted flesh, short, thick breath. It was the very ghost of Sikes. He laid his hand upon a chair which stood in the middle of the room, but shuddering as he was about to drop into it and seeming to glance over his shoulder, dragged it back close to the wall. As close as it would go, grounded against it and sat down. Not a word had been exchanged. He looked from one to another in silence. If an eye were furtively raised and met his, it was instantly averted. When his hollow voice broke silence, they all three started. They seemed never to have heard its tones before. "How came that dog here?" he asked. "Alone. 3 hours ago. Tonight's paper says that Fagin's taken. Is it true? Or a lie?" "True." They were silent again. "Damn you all," said Sikes, passing his hand across his forehead. "Have you nothing to say to me?" There was an uneasy movement among them, but nobody spoke. "You that keep this house," said Sikes, turning his face to Crackit. "Do you mean to sell me or to let me lie here till this hunt is over?" "You may stop here if you think it's safe," returned the person addressed after some hesitation. Sikes carried his eyes slowly up the wall behind him, rather trying to turn his head than actually doing it, and said, "Is I the body? Is it buried?" They shook their heads. "Why isn't it?" he retorted, with the same glance behind him. "What do they keep such ugly things above the ground for? Who's that knocking?" Crackit intimated, by a motion of his hand as he left the room, that there was nothing to fear, and directly came back with Charlie Bates behind him. Sikes sat opposite the door so that the moment the boy entered the room he encountered his figure. "Toby," said the boy, falling back as Sikes turned his eyes toward him. "Why didn't you tell me this downstairs?" There had been something so tremendous in the shrinking off of the three that the wretched man was willing to propitiate even this lad. Accordingly he nodded, and made as though he would shake hands with him. "Let me go into some other room," said the boy, retreating still further. "Charlie," said Sikes, stepping forward, Don't you know me?" "Don't come nearer me," answered the boy, still retreating and looking with horror in his eyes upon the murderer's face. "You monster!" The man stopped halfway, and they looked at each other, but Sikes's eyes sank gradually to the ground. "Witness, you three!" cried the boy, shaking his clenched fist and becoming more and more excited as he spoke. "Witness, you three! I'm not afraid of him. If they come here after him, I'll give him up. I will. I tell you out at once. He may kill me for it if he likes, or if he dares. But if I'm here, I'll give him up. I'd give him up if he was to be boiled alive. Murder. Help! If there's the pluck of a man among you three, you'll help me. Murder. Help! Down with him." Pouring out these cries and accompanying them with violent gesticulation, the boy actually threw himself single-handed upon the strong man, and in the intensity of his energy and the suddenness of his surprise, brought him heavily to the ground. The three spectators seemed quite stupefied. They offered no interference, and the boy and man rolled on the ground together. The former, heedless of the blows that showered upon him, wrenching his hands tighter and tighter in the garments about the murderer's breast, and never ceasing to call for help with all his might. The contest, however, was too unequal to last long. Sikes had him down, and his knee was on his throat, when Crackit pulled him back with a look of alarm and pointed to the window. There were lights gleaming below, voices in loud and earnest conversation, the tramp of hurried footsteps. Endless they seemed in number, crossing the nearest wooden bridge. One man on horseback seemed to be among the crowd, for there was the noise of hooves rattling on the uneven pavement. The gleam of lights increased. The footsteps came more thickly and noisily on. Then came a loud knocking at the door, and then a hoarse murmur from such a multitude of angry voices as would have made the boldest quail. "Help!" shrieked the boy, in a voice that rent the air. "He's here! Break down the door!" "In the king's name," cried the voices without, and the hoarse cry rose again, but louder. "Break down the door," screamed the boy. "I tell you they'll never open it. Run straight to the room where the light is. Break down the door." Strokes, thick and heavy, rattled upon the door and lower window shutters as he ceased to speak, and a loud huzzah burst from the crowd, giving the listener for the first time some adequate idea of its immense extent. "Open the door of some place where I can lock this screeching hell, babe," cried Sikes fiercely, running to and fro and dragging the boy now as easily as if he were an empty sack. "That door! Quick!" He flung him in, bolted it, and turned the key. "Is the downstairs door fast?" "Double locked and chained," replied Crackit, who, with the other two men, still remained quite helpless and bewildered. "The panels, are they strong?" "Lined with sheet iron." "And the windows, too?" "Yes, and the windows." "Damn you!" cried the desperate ruffian, throwing up the sash and menacing the crowd. "Do your worst. I'll cheat you yet." Of all the terrific yells that ever fell on mortal ears, none could exceed the cry of the infuriated throng. Some shouted to those who were nearest to set the house on fire. Others roared to the officers to shoot him dead. Among them all, none showed such fury as the man on horseback, who, throwing himself out of the saddle and bursting through the crowd as if he were parting water, cried beneath the window in a voice that rose above all others, "20 guineas to the man who brings a ladder." The nearest voices took up the cry, and hundreds echoed it. Some called for ladders, some for sledgehammers. Some ran with torches to and fro as if to seek them, and still came back and roared again. Some spent their breath in impotent curses and execrations. Some pressed forward with the ecstasy of madmen, and thus impeded the progress of those below. Some, among the boldest, attempted to climb up by the waterspout and crevices in the wall, and all waved to and fro in the darkness beneath, like a field of corn moved by an angry wind, and joined from time to time in one loud, furious roar. "The tide!" cried the murderer, as he staggered back into the room and shut the faces out. "The tide was in as I came up. Give me a rope, a long rope. They're all in front. I may drop into the folly ditch and clear off that way. Give me a rope, or I shall do 3 more murders and kill myself." The panic-stricken men pointed to where such articles were kept. The murderer, hastily selecting the longest and strongest cord, hurried up to the housetop. All the windows in the rear of the house had been long ago bricked up, except one small trap in the room where the boy was locked, and that was too small even for the passage of his body. But from this aperture he had never ceased to call on those without to guard the back. And thus, when the murderer emerged at last on the housetop by the door and the roof, a loud shout proclaimed the fact to those in front, who immediately began to pour round, pressing upon each other in one unbroken stream. He planted a board which he had carried up with him, for the purpose so firmly against the door that it must be matter of great difficulty to open it from the inside, and creeping over the tiles, looked over the low parapet. The water was out, and the ditch a bed of mud. The crowd had been hushed during these few moments, watching his motions and doubtful of his purpose, but the instant they perceived it and knew it was defeated, they raised a cry of triumphant execration, to which all their previous shouting had been whispers. Again and again it rose. Those who were at too great a distance to know its meaning took up the sound. It echoed and re-echoed. It seemed as though the whole city had poured its population out to curse him. On pressed the people from the front, on, in a strong, struggling current of angry faces, with here and there a glaring torch to light them up and show them out in all their wrath and passion. The houses on the opposite side of the ditch had been entered by the mob. Sashes were thrown up, or torn bodily out. There were tiers and tiers of faces in every window, and cluster upon cluster of people clinging to every housetop. Each little bridge, and there were 3 in sight, bent beneath the weight of the crowd upon it. Still the current poured on to find some nook or hole from which to vent their shouts, and only for an instant see the wretch. "They have him now!" cried a man on the nearest bridge. "Hurrah!" The crowd grew light with uncovered heads, and again the shout uprose. "I will give £50, cried an old gentleman from the same quarter, "to the man who takes him alive. I will remain here till he comes to ask me for it." There was another roar. At this moment the word was passed among the crowd that the door was forced at last, and that he who had first called for the ladder had mounted into the room. The stream abruptly turned, as this intelligence ran from mouth to mouth, and the people at the windows, seeing those upon the bridges pouring back, quitted their stations, and running into the street, joined the concourse that now thronged pell-mell to the spot they had left, each man crushing and striving with his neighbor, and all panting with impatience to get near the door and look upon the criminal as the officers brought him out. The cries and shrieks of those who were pressed almost to suffocation, or trampled down and trodden underfoot in the confusion, were dreadful. The narrow ways were completely blocked up, and at this time, between the rush of some to regain the space in front of the house and the unavailing struggles of others to extricate themselves from the mass, the immediate attention was distracted from the murderer, although the eagerness for his capture was increased. The man had shrunk down, thoroughly quelled by the ferocity of the crowd and the impossibility of escape, but seeing this sudden change with no less rapidity than it had occurred, he sprang upon his feet, determined to make an effort for his life by dropping into the ditch. Roused into new strength and energy, and stimulated by the noise within the house, which announced that an entrance had really been effected, he set his foot against the stack of chimneys, fastened one end of the rope tightly and firmly round it, and with the other made a strong running noose by the aid of his hands and teeth. Almost in a second, he could let himself down by the cord to within a less distance of the ground than his own height, and had his knife ready in his hand to cut it then and drop. At the very instant when he brought the loop over his head, previous to slipping it beneath his armpits, and when the old gentleman, before mentioned, who had clung so tight to the railing of the bridge as to resist the force of the crowd and retain his position, earnestly warned those about him that the man was about to lower himself down, at that very instant the murderer, looking behind him on the roof, threw his arms above his head and uttered a yell of terror. "The eyes again!" he cried in an unearthly screech. Staggering as if struck by lightning, he lost his balance and tumbled over the parapet. The noose was at his neck. It ran up with his weight, tight as a bowstring, and swift as the arrow it speeds. He fell for 35 feet. There was a sudden jerk, a terrific convulsion of the limbs, and there he hung with the open knife clenched in his stiffening hand. The old chimney quivered with the shock, but stood it bravely. The murderer swung lifeless against the wall, and the boy, thrusting aside the dangling body, which obscured his view, called to the people to come and take him out, for God's sake. A dog, which had lain concealed till now, ran backward and forward on the parapet with a dismal howl, and collecting himself for a spring, jumped for the dead man's shoulders. Missing his aim, he fell into the ditch, turning completely over as he went, and striking his head against a stone, dashed out his brains.